Hundreds of people are doing unbelievable things in our country, and sometimes they do it under a blanket almost, undercover.
At his peak,
For more than 6 decades, Cliff Richard has been one of the most recognizable voices in British popular music. Generations grew up hearing his songs, watching him perform on television, and seeing him fill concert halls around the world. He became a symbol of an era when British pop music was beginning to change forever. But behind the polished suits, the reassuring smile, and the seemingly endless career was a private life that very few people truly understood. Today, when people look at Cliff Richard, they do not simply see the energetic performer who once dominated the charts. They see an older man who has lived through an extraordinary amount of history. He has watched musical fashions change, witnessed entire generations of performers rise and disappear, and continue performing long after many of his contemporaries had retired. Yet one part of his story has remained remarkably consistent. Cliff Richard never married and never became a father. For much of his life, he appeared completely comfortable with that decision. His Christian faith became an important part of his identity, and he often explained that marriage was a commitment he did not want to enter unless he could give it everything. His career demanded enormous amounts of time. Touring meant airports, hotels, rehearsals, recording studios, and long stretches away from home. Cliff understood that kind of lifestyle could make a traditional family life difficult. There was also something else behind his decision. He valued his independence. He had built a life around music, faith, friends, and personal freedom, and for decades he appeared convinced that happiness did not require marriage. He resisted the idea that everyone had to follow the same path. To him, a successful life did not necessarily mean having a spouse and children. But as the years passed, his perspective became more complicated. Cliff had experienced relationships and had openly acknowledged that women had been important parts of his life. One of the most famous was his friendship with Olivia Newton-John. He later admitted that he had fallen in love with her during the 1970s, although she was already committed elsewhere. Their relationship never became a marriage, but they remained close for many years. Cliff continued to speak warmly about her, and her death in 2022 was an especially painful loss for someone who had known her for decades. There were other romances and close relationships as well, including his connection with television presenter Sue Barker. What began as romance eventually developed into a lifelong friendship. Barker ultimately married someone else, while Cliff continued concentrating on his music and career. Yet none of these relationships resulted in the family life that many people assumed he would eventually have. And this is where Cliff Richard's story becomes unexpectedly emotional. At one point, he acknowledged that there were moments when he wondered what life might have been like if he had chosen differently. He was not necessarily talking about romantic love. He was talking about the ordinary companionship that comes with having a family, someone waiting at home, someone sharing everyday experiences, someone present when the applause has stopped. For a performer who spent decades surrounded by thousands of people, that distinction is important. Cliff could walk onto a stage in front of an enormous audience and hear thousands of voices singing his songs. But eventually the concert ended. The lights went down. The audience disappeared. The road crew packed everything away. And he returned to private life. The reference material described his reflections on those quiet moments as one of the more vulnerable aspects of his story. For decades, he had insisted that he did not regret choosing his career and his independent life. But that did not mean he had never wondered about the road not taken. Then came another chapter that tested him in a completely different way. In 2014, Cliff Richard's carefully protected private world was suddenly shattered when police searched his home during an investigation into an allegation dating back decades. Cliff was away in Portugal at the time and learned what was happening through television coverage. The sight of police officers searching his property was broadcast publicly, turning an intensely private matter into a national spectacle. He denied the allegation and continued to do so. The investigation ultimately became a defining and deeply distressing period of his life, not simply because of the allegation itself, but because of the extraordinary publicity surrounding the police operation. For someone who had spent his entire career carefully maintaining a respectable public image, suddenly finding himself at the center of such a story was devastating. And yet, remarkably, it was not the end of Cliff Richard's career. He continued recording. He continued performing. He continued appearing in public. But as he grew older, another reality began to emerge, one that had nothing to do with fame, controversy, or music. Time itself was beginning to catch up with him. The years that followed did not erase Cliff Richard's determination to keep performing, but they changed what performing meant to him. For most of his career, touring had been almost second nature. He could travel from one country to another, step onto a stage, and command a room with the confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime doing exactly that. But growing older meant that the physical demands of performing could no longer be ignored. There is a strange contradiction in Cliff's later life. The man himself has aged, but the voice that made him famous has remained one of the strongest connections to his younger years. Even as movement became more difficult, his ability to sing continued to give audiences glimpses of the performer he had always been. That distinction became particularly important during his later concerts. Audiences began noticing that Cliff did not move around a stage with quite the same freedom as he once had. The energetic performer who had spent decades turning concerts into spectacles was now approaching performances differently. He could no longer pretend that age had not changed his body, but he also refused to treat aging as surrender. That attitude became even more significant after a serious health scare. According to the reference material, a medical examination arranged in connection with insurance for a planned tour led doctors to discover prostate cancer. The discovery came unexpectedly. Cliff had not originally gone looking for a cancer diagnosis. The examination was connected with preparations for his professional wake, but the results revealed something that might otherwise have remained undetected. The news could have brought his career to an immediate halt. Instead, Cliff faced it directly. The most important part of the diagnosis was that doctors found the cancer before it had spread. That gave him an opportunity to receive treatment and continue living his life. In December 2025, he appeared on Good Morning Britain and discussed the situation publicly, saying that he had been told the cancer was gone at that point, but he did not describe himself as permanently cured. He emphasized that nobody could guarantee it would never return. That caution said a great deal about how Cliff viewed life at this stage. For decades, he had lived with the confidence of someone who believed there would always be another tour, another recording session, another concert, another opportunity. A cancer diagnosis changes that certainty. Suddenly, the future is no longer something that can simply be assumed, and Cliff used the experience to deliver a message that went beyond himself. He encouraged people to get checked. His words were not presented as those of a medical expert. They came from someone who had unexpectedly discovered that a serious illness could be present without dominating his everyday life. The diagnosis had reminded him how valuable early detection could be. Yet perhaps the most revealing part of Cliff's later story is what happened after the diagnosis. He did not suddenly decide that life was over. He continued thinking about music. He continued thinking about performing. And, perhaps most importantly, he refused to use the word retirement too easily. There is a psychological difference between stopping and retiring, and Cliff appears to understand that distinction very clearly. The reference describes his reluctance to regard retirement as a permanent door closing. He has suggested that stopping could simply mean taking a break, leaving open the possibility that he might return to the stage whenever he felt ready. That may sound like a small difference in language, but for someone who has spent more than 60 years building his identity around music, it is enormous. Retirement suggests an ending. Stopping suggests a pause. And Cliff Richard has never seemed particularly comfortable with endings. Perhaps that is because his entire life has been built around reinvention. He survived changes in musical fashion that destroyed the careers of countless other performers. He watched rock and roll transform into pop, pop transform again and again, and new generations of stars replace the previous ones. Yet somehow, he kept finding reasons to remain relevant. But there's another side to his later years that is much quieter. The loneliness. The reference material describes Cliff as living a relatively private life, without the traditional family structure that many people eventually build. That does not necessarily mean he is unhappy. It would be unfair to make that assumption. Cliff has friends, colleagues, family members, fans, and a deeply established faith. He has also repeatedly defended the life choices he made. But there's a difference between being surrounded by people and having someone beside you every day. And that may be the part of Cliff Richard's story that audiences find most difficult to think about. The man who once performed for enormous crowds now lives in a world where the applause inevitably ends. The stages become smaller. The tours become harder. The body demands more rest. And time becomes something that can no longer be ignored. Yet when Cliff sings, something remarkable happens. For a few minutes, the decades seem to disappear. The voice remains, the songs remain, the memories remain, and perhaps that is why he continues to resist the idea that his story is finished. Because as long as he can still sing, there is still a connection to the person he has been for more than 60 years. And for Cliff Richard, that connection may be worth more than fame itself. As Cliff Richard moved deeper into his later years, the question was no longer whether he could continue performing exactly as he had in his youth. The more difficult question was whether he could find a way to keep music in his life while accepting that his body was changing. That is a reality almost every performer eventually has to confront. But Cliff's situation was unusual because performing was not simply his profession. It had become part of his identity. For more than 60 years, the stage had been the place where he felt most completely himself. Giving that up would mean more than ending a job. It would mean closing a chapter that had defined nearly his entire adult existence. And that is why the word retirement has apparently remained uncomfortable for him. He has drawn a distinction between retiring and simply stopping. Retirement sounds permanent. Stopping can be temporary. A person can stop touring for a while, and then change their mind. They can wake up months later, hear a song, feel the urge to perform, and decide they want to do another concert. That possibility matters to Cliff. The reference material specifically describes his reluctance to regard retirement as a final decision. Perhaps there is another reason the idea of stopping feels so difficult. Cliff Richard has already watched so many people from his generation disappear. The music industry that created his career is almost unrecognizable today. Many of the performers who once shared stages, recording studios, television programs, and magazine covers with him are gone. Younger generations know their names primarily through old recordings and archive footage. Cliff, meanwhile, remains. That can be a strange position to occupy. Being a survivor of an era is an honor, but it can also be lonely. Every year brings another reminder that time does not stop. Another friend dies. Another familiar face disappears. Another place associated with the past changes beyond recognition. And suddenly the person who once felt like part of a huge community becomes one of the few people left who can personally remember what that world was really like. That sense of history may explain why Cliff has remained so protective of his memories and his private life. He has never been someone who needed to reveal everything. Even at the height of his fame, he kept certain parts of himself away from public view. His faith became one of the strongest foundations of his life, giving him a framework through which he could understand both success and disappointment. His Christian beliefs also influenced his decision not to marry. Rather than treating marriage as something everyone was expected to pursue, he viewed it as a serious commitment. He did not want to enter into that commitment simply because society expected him to. But there's a painful irony in that choice. A person can be completely confident about a decision and still occasionally wonder what another life might have looked like. Cliff has acknowledged that there were times when he thought about the family he never had. That does not necessarily mean he regretted his choices. It means he was human. There is a difference between regret and curiosity. Sometimes people look backward not because they wish to rewrite their lives, but because they wonder about the roads they never traveled. What if he had married? What if he had children? What would his house sound like today? Would retirement feel different if there were grandchildren waiting to visit? Those are questions that have no answers. And perhaps that is what makes the later part of Cliff Richard's story so emotional. For decades, he had everything that fame could provide. He had money, houses, international success, awards, devoted fans, and a career that most performers could only dream about. Yet there are certain things fame cannot purchase. It cannot turn back time. It cannot bring back people who have died. It cannot guarantee health. And it cannot create the family life that a person chose not to build. That reality became especially visible after the death of Olivia Newton-John. Cliff had known Olivia for decades and had openly spoken about his affection for her. Her death in 2022 was therefore not simply the loss of another famous performer. It was the loss of someone who had been connected to important chapters of his own life. For Cliff, memories like that inevitably become more important with age. When you are 30, losing someone can feel like an isolated tragedy. When you are 90, loss can become a pattern. You begin realizing that your memories are becoming older than the people around you. And yet Cliff continues. That may be the most remarkable thing about him. He does not appear to be pretending that aging is easy. He does not have the physical freedom he once possessed, and his cancer diagnosis forced him to confront his own mortality in a much more direct way. The reference material says a cancer was detected before it had spread, and that Cliff later announced that it was gone at that point, while acknowledging that nobody can know with certainty whether it will return. But instead of turning that experience into a declaration that his life is finished, he used it to encourage others to take their health seriously. That may be one of the clearest signs of how his priorities have changed. When he was young, the future seemed endless. Now, every year has greater value. Every concert means more. Every friendship matters more. Every opportunity to sing becomes something to appreciate rather than something to assume will always be available. And perhaps that is the real story behind how Cliff Richard lives now. It is not simply a story about an elderly entertainer whose body has slowed down. It is about a man looking back at an extraordinary life while still refusing to close the door on what might come next. The stage may eventually disappear. The tours may eventually become impossible. But as long as Cliff Richard still believes there's another song to sing, he is not finished. And that may be the saddest and most beautiful part of his story. As Cliff Richard approaches the later chapters of his life, perhaps the most striking thing is that he still refuses to let the past become his entire identity. He has every reason to look backward. His career stretches across generations, musical revolutions, changing technology, and cultural shift that transformed Britain itself. Yet he continues to speak about the future, even while acknowledging the realities of growing older. There is something deeply human about that. For decades, Cliff lived in a world where tomorrow meant another recording session, another television appearance, another tour, another concert. His calendar was constantly filled. His life moved from one professional commitment to the next. Now, the pace is naturally different. There is more time to reflect, more time to remember, and perhaps more time to notice the silence between the moments that once seemed to come endlessly. That silence can be difficult for someone who spent most of his life surrounded by noise. The roar of an audience, the sound of a band warming up backstage, the applause after a performance, the excitement of seeing his name on another chart. Those experiences shaped Cliff Richard for more than 60 years. But eventually every performer discovers that the applause cannot last forever. And yet Cliff has never seemed interested in pretending that he is still the man he was at 25. His later life has instead been about adapting. His health has become more important. His faith remains central. His friendships have taken on greater significance. Memories of people he loved and lost have become part of his everyday life. And the possibility of performing again remains something he does not completely rule out. That attitude is especially meaningful considering what happened in 2014. The police investigation that resulted in a search of Cliff's home became one of the most painful experiences of his public life. He denied the allegation involved, and the Crown Prosecution Service ultimately announced that there would be no charges. But the experience left a lasting emotional impact. For someone who had spent decades cultivating a carefully guarded private existence, seeing his home surrounded by police and the images broadcast across the country were profoundly unsettling. It demonstrated something that fame often hides. Celebrity does not provide complete protection from humiliation, fear, or uncertainty. Sometimes, in fact, fame makes those experiences more difficult because millions of strangers are watching. Cliff survived that period too, and then came cancer. Again, he survived. The discovery of prostate cancer during a medical examination connected to his touring plans could have forced him to completely rethink his future. Instead, treatment gave him the chance to continue. By late 2025, he publicly said that he had been told the cancer was gone, while also acknowledging that nobody could promise it would never return. That statement is perhaps more powerful than a dramatic declaration of victory, because Cliff understood something that many people only learn with age. You do not control everything that happens to you. You can take care of yourself. You can seek treatment. You can remain positive, but you cannot control the future. And once you accept that, the present becomes more valuable. That may explain why Cliff continues to cherish music. Music has always been the one constant. Everything else changed. People changed. Relationships changed. Technology changed. The music business changed. His body changed. But the songs remained. A song recorded 60 years ago can still sound exactly the same today. A voice captured on an old recording does not age with the person who created it. That is one of the strange gifts of music. For Cliff Richard, it means a younger version of himself is still present. When audiences hear those familiar recordings, they hear the energy of another era. They hear the performer who once stood beneath bright stage lights with decades of future success still ahead of him, and then they see the man he became. That contrast can be emotional, but perhaps it should not be viewed only as sad. Cliff Richard has lived a life that very few people could ever duplicate. He survived changing musical fashions and remained relevant. He experienced extraordinary success without completely surrendering his privacy. He faced controversies that could have destroyed his reputation. He dealt with serious illness. He watched friends and fellow performers disappear. And still, he kept going. That is why the phrase, "how he lives now will break your heart," only tells half the story. Yes, there's sadness. There's aging. There's loss. There are roads he never traveled and people he can never bring back. But there's also gratitude. There's faith. There's music. And there's the stubborn determination of a man who has spent his entire life refusing to believe that one difficult chapter automatically means the end of the book. Cliff Richard may no longer be the young rock and roll star who electrified audiences in the early days of British pop. He does not need to be. That young man already gave the world his songs. The older man now carries something different: memories, experience, perspective, and an understanding of how quickly life can change. And perhaps that is what makes his story so moving. The real tragedy would not be growing old. The real tragedy would be reaching old age and having nothing meaningful to look back on. Cliff Richard has the opposite problem. He has an entire lifetime of memories, thousands of performances, millions of records, countless friendships, major triumphs, deep disappointments, moments of love, moments of loss, and enough history behind him to fill several lifetimes. So when people ask how Cliff Richard lives now, the answer is not simply that he is older. He is still living with everything that came before. And perhaps that is the burden and the privilege of surviving long enough to become a legend. The final chapter of Cliff Richard's story is not really about fame. It is about what remains when fame is no longer the most important thing. For a man who began his career when rock and roll was still something new and rebellious, the sheer length of his journey is almost impossible to comprehend. He has lived through the rise of television, the arrival of color broadcasting, the transformation of recorded music, the birth of the internet, and the social media age. Entire generations have grown up and grown old while Cliff remained a familiar name. But the person standing at the end of that journey is inevitably different from the young man who began it. There are fewer certainties now. Health cannot simply be taken for granted. Friends from earlier chapters are no longer here. His career is no longer something that can continue indefinitely without interruption. And the question of what comes next carries a weight it never had when he was 20. Yet Cliff still appears to approach the future with curiosity rather than fear. That may be because his faith has always provided him with another way of looking at life. His Christian beliefs have remained an important part of his identity, and throughout his career he has spoken openly about how important that faith is to him. It has influenced his decisions, his values, and the way he has responded to difficult periods. That does not mean faith has made his life painless. It simply gave him somewhere to place the pain. The losses he experienced cannot be undone. The relationships that ended cannot be rewritten. The family life he never created cannot suddenly appear decades later. And the years that have passed cannot be recovered. But they can be remembered. And perhaps remembering has become one of the most important parts of Cliff's life. There is something bittersweet about seeing an artist survive long enough to watch his own history become nostalgia. Songs that were once new are now considered classics. Performances that once represented the future are now pieces of archival history. Yet for Cliff, those memories are not simply museum pieces. They are his life. That is why his connection with audiences remains so powerful. Fans are not merely listening to an old singer. They are remembering themselves. Someone hears one of Cliff's early songs and remembers being young. Another remembers a first romance. Someone else remembers a parent playing his records. Another remembers a concert they attended decades ago. In that sense, Cliff Richard's music has become intertwined with the memories of millions of other people. And that is a form of immortality no chart position can provide. His voice exists in recordings that can be played long after he is gone. His performances exist in photographs and film. His story exists in the memories of people who were there. That does not make aging easy, but it gives meaning to the years. Perhaps the saddest part of Cliff's current life is therefore not that he is old. It is that he has reached an age where the past is inevitably becoming larger than the future. When you are young, the future seems enormous. When you are older, the past can feel enormous. Cliff has spent more than 60 years filling that past, and yet he still refuses to behave as though his story is finished. His health scare demonstrated that attitude clearly. After being diagnosed with prostate cancer, he underwent treatment and later shared the encouraging news that he had been told the cancer was gone. But rather than claiming certainty about what would happen next, he acknowledged the reality that no one can know exactly what the future holds. That honesty may be more meaningful than any declaration of invincibility. Cliff Richard was once portrayed as almost endlessly youthful. Now he has become something different, a reminder that even the people who seem larger than life eventually face the same limitations as everyone else. The difference is that he has spent his life preparing for this moment without realizing it. Every song about love, every song about hope, every performance about finding joy, every moment of faith, every goodbye backstage. They all prepared him for a stage that eventually becomes quieter. And perhaps that is why audiences should not look at Cliff Richard's later years only through the lens of sadness. There is sadness, certainly, but there is also extraordinary gratitude. He achieved what countless aspiring musicians dream about, and almost none accomplish. He built a career that survived changing generations. He remained recognizable for more than half a century. He created music that became part of people's lives. And he did it while remaining remarkably committed to his own choices. He did not marry simply because people expected him to. He did not have children simply because society considered that the natural next step. He did not abandon his faith because the entertainment industry changed. And he did not completely surrender his private life just because millions of people wanted to know more. Those decisions came with costs, but they were his decisions. That is an important distinction. A life does not have to resemble everyone else's life to have meaning. Cliff Richard's story proves that. Perhaps he sometimes wonders what might have happened if he had chosen differently. Most people do. But wondering about another life does not erase the value of the life you actually lived. And Cliff Richard has lived an extraordinary one. So when the lights eventually go out for the final time, the most important thing will not be whether he performed one last concert. It will be what remains afterward. The songs will remain. The recordings will remain. The memories will remain. And somewhere, someone will eventually hear that unmistakable voice for the first time and wonder who this extraordinary performer was. Then the story begins again, because that is what music does. It allows people to outlive their own moment. And perhaps, after everything Cliff Richard has experienced, the triumphs, the heartbreaks, the controversy, the illness, the friendships, the losses, and the extraordinary passage of time, that is the most comforting ending imaginable. He may have grown older. He may have slowed down. His world may be quieter than it once was. But the voice that defined generations has not disappeared. And as long as those songs continue to play, Cliff Richard's story is not really an ending. It is a memory that refuses to fade.